Hello and greetings to all you global African citizens all over the world, whether in Africa and abroad. Welcome to the Sankara Report podcast. And this is going to be our first episode ever of this podcast, which we hope will bring you many more in many months and years to come. But we just want to build up a social platform where we can come and share our thoughts on things that are affecting the people of Africans globally, and where we stand in among the global family of civilization, countries, and the people. So today, first, just to give you a little intro on what's going on in political world, geopolitics, socio-economical movements, and to touch up on all the things that are unfolding in Cuba. So this podcast is meant to inform, share, and educate Africans, African diaspora, and global citizens on matter relating to people of African ancestry. So Thomas. The Sankara report is named after Thomas Isidore Sankara, also known as the Upright Man, who was a revolutionary figure from Burkina Faso. Born in Yoko, Burkina Faso in December 21st, 1949, and assassinated by the French in October 15th, 1987. Sankara was a champion of development who uplifted women voices, built over 350 schools within 3 years of his reign, built hospitals, roads, and brought dignity to people of Burkina Faso before his assassination. We will touch back on Sankara in the future episodes, but today we want to talk about Cuba, which is currently making news all around the world. So Cuba still remains a mystery as a country to many people, and it stays that way due to the Western media, how they portray it and what they want people to know about Cuba, based on their perception. But for most Africans, and at least those who read and are inquisitive enough, Cuba has always been a liberator of sort. At least that's how we see it, right? In fact, Nelson Mandela and Castro have always had a very cordial, close friendship until Mandela's death. This is Mandela that's, known as the angel, one of the most revered men of this century. In this because Cuba was the leading country in training and funding South African freedom fighters, the anti-apartheid movement, back when apartheid was still a very popular concept in the Western Hemisphere. The Western countries were in full support of apartheid because they considered apartheid regime to be pro-capitalism during the Cold War, when there was the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc.
When they first met.
Before we say anything,
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You say, no,
No, un momentito.
Es seguro, si ya yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide
Y nos ha
variety of
visitado una
people.
gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que nos
get
dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people
que
as
entrenó a nuestros
doctors and so
combatientes, a
on.
nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria
I
surafricana.
haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Quiero por él
homeland.
y para el pueblo.
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the
Well,
South African people.
You can always hear cases where there's a there's a place where former state secretary Kissinger talked about why US was involved in supporting apartheid regime to try take over Angola, and it was because they saw Angola, which was lined up towards Cuba and Russia, to be pro-communism, and so for US not to be involved directly in Angola, they had to funnel funds to apartheid regime to go take over Angola. So apartheid was not just a South African machinery, but it was a Western machinery to get control of African resources, especially in Southern Africa. When you talk about minerals and oil, it was a very big thing. Also, if you remember the gentleman by the name of Che Guevara, again, depending on where you stand, you can see him as a terror or a terrorist, or you can see him as a revolutionary and someone who's like a savior. But if you're in Africa, Che Guevara is nothing less than a hero and a savior. This is someone who left his comfort to go to Congo and help fight against the colonialism. When Congolese were fighting and they were disorganized, they didn't have good military. It was Che who went there to help them organize themselves in order to repel or fight the colonialists, the Belgians and sorts, the Europeans. So he's someone who is also very valued in African domain. So Afro-Cubans have always been a part of global African family and have battled scars to prove of this. What's going on in Cuba currently, however, is something that spells doom and danger to our brothers and sisters in Cuba. The movement in Cuba currently, that is sponsored mostly by white Cubans in Miami, could spell a dangerous outcome to Afro-Cubans who make about 11% of the population. Remember, the reason why most white Cubans started migrating to Florida and the USA at large was due to the confiscation of their sugar plantation, where they had Afro-Cubans as slaves. In a nutshell, white Cubans always preferred a country like most other Western hemisphere countries, where whites are treated special and highly ranked, while black people are kept at the bottom of the food chain. Castro, whose father was a white Cuban from Spain and an aristocrat, who was on top of the food chain, had an affair with one of the maids who became Castro's mother. Now, because of this, and with intention to keep this from being public, this was a big political government figure. Castro grew up with the servants, whom most of them were blacks. This is where Castro grew a strong bond with the black people of Cuba, and hated racial hierarchy, and that had existed in Cuba before. He felt like, growing up, being almost isolated from the mainstream, even though his father was powerful, was because his mother was more just like a servant. So he took this very personally and hated the idea of oppression. There are indeed problems in Cuba, and how they are all started, who caused them, and we can debate that, to eternity. And, there are people whose mind is already fixed on where the problem is, and it's a very narrow point of view. And so it's very hard to help change, discuss this with people like these. But most certainly, the end of Castro regime might also be the beginning of a slow, almost genocide on Afro-Cubans. Cuba is a beautiful tropical island. Most black people live in highly valued, property areas, and I'm not talking about like the rich. I'm talking about people living in, even if it's a rundown home or house or apartment, the location are so strategically placed next to high value real estate areas that can absorb so much tourism and wealth. And there indeed, most certainly, the end of Castro regime will bring in an inflow of changes, socioeconomic changes, that will definitely, and I can certainly say will definitely disenfranchise Afro-Cubans. The change of regime and entry of capitalism would bring the biggest gentrification we have never seen. Remember, the wealthiest Cubans are all white Cubans living in Miami. You know, the Castros and all, some of these are senators, Senator Cruz, and hardly any blacks. If you go to Cuba, you can walk around. If you go to Florida, Miami, you can walk around and you'd hardly meet any Afro-Cuban. They will eventually force out most of Afro-Cubans from Havana and all these high prime real estate areas, and eventually you will never even hear or see any Afro-Cubans even in Cuba itself. Most Africans or black people do not know that Argentina once had a population of black people almost the same size as Cuba. But Argentina was successful in writing itself off black people. As unbelievable as that is, that was the case. It was a systemic, slow removal of black people to whitewash Argentina. You can look up this. This also could make an entire new genocide episode. But just to bring it to you, you can take do a research on your own and find out more. But Argentina did this. At the same time, they were also giving ex-Nazi soldier places to live in Argentina. Argentina became the hotspot where ex-Nazis would run away for exile to escape law and repercussion. The current situation, no matter how you look at it, for better or for worse, with sympathy and support or with suspicion, will be very unkind to our brothers and sisters in Cuba. People like Ashata Shakur will be extradited. Afro-Cubans have been who have benefited from equality of accessibility to education and in medicine will be disenfranchised. Most people do not know that the first black astronaut to space was Cuban by the name of Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez. This was way before USA, when black soldiers in Tuskegee were still being used as rablats for experiment. So no matter where you stand and the current unfolding in Cuba, and I'm not here to tell you where to stand. Remember, as an African, both in African diaspora, status quo may not be ideal, and how to change is up for debate. But revolution led by white Cubans in Florida will be a doomsday to most Afro-Cubans. The people still have a vendetta towards blacks. Most of them were anti-abolition of slaves. Most of them, their families owned slaves and felt they lost their properties and wealth when slavery was ended, which was much later time compared to the rest of the world, because there was an exception, an agreement in the West that because there was so much need for sugar, and Cuba at some point was the biggest producer of sugar, that they would allow some form of slavery in Cuba to continue almost up to the late 1800s, early 1900s, to supply the world with supply the West, US and the West with sugar. And so that's, you can see at the turning point when the pushback started, and most plantation owners, who most of them were European Cubans from Spain to Eastern Europe to other parts, started fleeing to the US. and started feeling that, if we're not gonna be aristocrat in Cuba, then we're not gonna be living side by side by people who were our slaves, and therefore most of them resorted to either relocating to a country which back then had Jim Crow, United States. So they preferred going to US to actually live in a place where they had some level of status as white, and so if you look at the history and the current what's going on right now, you can see why white Cubans are always very much at arms when you talk about the Castro regime. They feel like Castro to them is the biggest anti-abolitionist for them, that took away their wealth, and their wealth that include sugar plantation, land ownership, and farm and slaves, because it was only when they left that some of these lands were given to Afro-Cubans who have worked on them as slaves. So most of these people, all they want is to be able to go back, reclaim their land, kick out Afro-Cubans who live in those places, maybe turn these properties into tourism destination, high-end corporate offices, and all things you can name. And that's gonna come with one price, and that price is gonna be displacement of Afro-Cubans. So it's a very, very dangerous place for Afro-Cuban, good for white Cubans, but extremely it's a dangerous wormhole, if I may use that, for Afro-Cubans. So usually when you see these things going on, you have to be able to decipher and try to figure out, like, cui bono, to whom does it benefit? To whom does any single revolution benefit? Civil rights, to whom did it benefit? Abolitionism, to whom did it benefit? And who fought to stop it? And these are things which are systematically repetitious throughout our life. It's 2021, and believe me, the difference between now and 19th or 18th century is very, very, very minimal. So you don't be fooled by the time and the media saying that, oh, things are better. Things are never better. They're not better. If it's better, it's just end up racism, end up inequality, end up socioeconomic oppression, pay reparations to people who deserve it, African Americans, Afro-Cubans, all descendants of slaves, give them back what they deserve. And then once you do that, you compensate someone for their time and suffering. Then you can say, like, okay, this is a starting point. This is a starting point for reconciliation. This is a starting point for leveling the field. But you can't use someone for hundreds of years for slave-free labor with no right to own a land, not even right to be full human being. And then, because it becomes something of a shame, you say that, okay, I stopped, but now we are equal. There's no equality there. There has to be some level of a payback. There's to be some level of a repercussion. There have to be, an insurance of not only cash payment for the labor done, which was free, but there has to be some cash payment, some insurance of land. If you know how this thing work, the UK just finished paying off former slave owners all their losses. UK for the last couple 100 years have been paying former slave owners, I mean, they paid it back in the day, but they had to borrow the money to pay them for loss of slaves when slavery was banned. They had to pay people who were trading slaves and people who owned slaves a compensation for the loss of their wealth, which was slaves. And so they borrowed this money to pay these people. And if you think this is a long time ago, they just finished paying that loan like 2 years ago. It's insane. But they were paying the slaveholders and traders. But what about the slave themselves? Those who were enslaved. Did they get anything? No, they didn't. Because they don't value you. They don't value, descendants of slaves or people who were enslaved. They don't value Africans. There's no way you can tell me that someone who saw you as 3/5 of a human being 40 years ago suddenly now has a change of heart and now think that you're just a human being as me. No, they don't. They just feel it's impolite to say it now publicly, but deep down they do think it is what it is. And that's why it's so easy for a cop to shoot at a black person point blank, even if they know that they're not armed, because they don't put value into your life. So these are things that we have to reckon with. We have to look back and look at how this systematic racism and oppression, how it plays into the 2021, the 21st century. And we'll be so blind and so ignorant to think that things are now better. Things are not better until they're equal. So it's up to us, of African people, both in Africa and abroad, to start pretty much pushing up the bar on what we deem acceptable. The idea that we just accept things based on narrative of people who oppress you to tell you like, okay, this is good now, you take it and be appreciative. That's very naive. We have to move away from that. We have to get to a point where we are dictating the terms of things that we want and how we want them, just like every community in the world does. So we have to look and see that in what's going on in Cuba, what is it in there for Afro-Cubans? Do they just use them as fodder, as face? And then once the oligarchs and aristocrats of white Cubans get a hold of that island, they're just gonna kick these people out, take over their lands, properties, kick them out, and actually even create a form of racism there. You have to look at all these facts. It's probably better for Afro-Cubans to go into this saying that, we want a piece of this land now before we join any fight. If there has to be a change of regime, we want to know and we want to document and we want to know that we own a piece of this island with land title deeds and ownership recorded before you get used and then abused and then, chewed and thrown out. So my brothers and sisters, this is what I wanted to bring to your attention today. And I know it's very controversial and I know people have different opinions on this. And no matter what you think and what side you are on, just for a moment, put the emotions aside and think about what is it that Afro-Cubans get to benefit from this? Who's going to benefit from this more? You know, it's just like the World Wars or the Vietnam War, where African Americans helped fight, but who was benefiting from these wars? It was the corporate Americans, and most of them are, the white community. So let's clear our mind and start thinking more critically and not emotionally, and see how things unfold, but always be very diligent and know that there is a population of African descendant in Cuba who are at a very, very high risk of losing everything. So thank you again, my brothers and sisters universally. And this marks the end of the first episode. We'll bring you a different episode every week. So if you see this, subscribe wherever you are. Always share with friends. And we want to build a very critical thinking platform where we will tackle every issue from an intellectual point of view, but not emotionally. And therefore, I want to thank you all very much for your perseverance and your survival. But now it's time we stop surviving and actually start thriving. And with that, thank you very much. And I'll see you on the next one.